Since Disney's coming out with their live-action remake of Snow White, I thought I'd take a look at the original. In my opinion, Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is one of their most important films. At the time, the company was in pretty major debt, with Walt taking on personal risks like mortgaging his home and selling his car, just to finance the film. He also had quite a bit to prove. At the time, Hollywood did not believe in a full-length animated feature, with many of his contemporaries writing the film off as Disney's folly. So in many ways, the company's future hinged on Snow White being successful, both financially and for the reputation, along with the future of animated movies in general, since Hollywood wasn't willing to risk it at the time. But despite the odds, thanks to Disney's ingenuity and hard work, Snow White became a critical and commercial success, paving the way for Disney going forward. Snow White has gone on to become a beloved classic for many generations of people, but it has received criticism over the years too, some of which, in my opinion, is not really warranted. Having an overall cynical take about Snow White, saying that she's a bad character who's a damsel in distress, and her only characteristics include cooking and cleaning, an attitude that even the stars of the remake hold.
You said you were bringing a modern edge to it on stage. What do you mean by that?
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and we absolutely wrote a Snow White that
she's not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved by the prince, and she's not going to be dreaming about true love.
While everyone's entitled to their opinions, I think it's a biased take. However, Disney themselves seems to have given into this idea, often using their live-action remakes as an attempt to fix the originals. However, this attitude caused a lot of backlash when it comes to this recent Snow White remake. Over the past few years, people have been pretty vocal about their disappointment in Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot's statements, even though they're far from the only people to make these kinds of claims, including previous live-action Disney remakes. But here we are. In my opinion, the original Snow White actually holds up pretty well, considering the fact the film is 85 years old. It is admittedly pretty dated. For example, Snow White's hair and falsetto voice were very trendy at the time. The humor is also very 1930s as well, like they have a whole scene where the dwarves just wash up before dinner. Some argue this scene causes the film to grind to a halt, but it was just something they did back then. There was also limitations with what they could do artistically. At the time, a lot of cartoon characters were animals or very out-of-proportion people, but for Snow White they wanted to have more realistically proportioned humans, but since it wasn't really done, they had struggles with it. Before Snow White, they had a short called Goddess of Spring, about the Persephone myth, which was Disney's first attempt at realistically proportioned humans, and while it's a good effort, there's still room for improvement, particularly when it comes to realistic movement on a human figure. As they were working on Snow White, they became more confident when it came to female figures, and comparing the dancing scenes in Snow White to Goddess of Spring, it's pretty impressive how far they came in only 3 years. However, they found themselves still struggling when it came to male figures. The original script had the prince playing a larger role in the story, but they decided to ultimately cut a lot of his scenes, finding him too difficult to animate still. Much of these scenes were eventually repurposed for Prince Philip in Sleeping Beauty, after decades of practicing, and they instead replaced it with scenes of the dwarves being comedic, since they were easier to animate. But I would argue that what we did get of Snow White and the prince were a lot deeper and meaningful than people give it credit for. Snow White as a character tends to be written off as weak and useless, a passive princess that basically represents everything wrong with Disney princesses. But overall, I think her characterization is actually pretty nuanced, and she's a lot more active in the story than people give her credit for. Sure, she's a bit naive and too trusting, but it's okay for characters to have flaws. But honestly, Snow White's pretty strong-willed. She spent her whole life being pushed around by the evil queen, forced to be a scullery maid in her own castle, but she doesn't allow the mistreatment to break her, remaining positive and kind-hearted. When this movie was released, the Great Depression was going on, and in many ways Snow White's plight reflects the people at the time. The economic downturn and natural disasters like the Dust Bowl caused people to suffer greatly, and all people really had at the time to keep going was hope that things would get better eventually. So Snow White is an honest, hardworking person who's being mistreated by forces outside of her control, something very relatable to audiences at the time. And to be honest, I still think it's pretty relevant today, and something that will probably continue to be relevant. Really, Snow White represents resilience. Even through all of her struggles, she always picks herself up. She's kind and humble, even though she's the second highest authority in the land. She could be like her stepmother, arrogant, vain, and throws her power around without any concern for others. She rules with an iron fist and has absolute authority. But Snow White never puts her power above others. She's always courteous and thinking about others' well-being. While out picking flowers, she sees a baby bird who is injured and lost its family, and she goes out of her way to help it, even though she doesn't have to, which comes back around to help her. her. The husband reveals he only brought her out here to kill her, but finds he doesn't have the heart to go through with it. So he tells her to run and that she can never go home, leaving her alone in the woods. And this entire experience is very intense and traumatic. She ends up running through the forest screaming, which scares all the animals, but the little bird she helped earlier recognizes her and convinces the others to help. The animals lead her to the dwarves' cottage, and here's where a lot of the criticism usually starts. Where the cottage is very dirty, it seems like the dwarves work in the mines all day and then they just come home and don't really bother cleaning. They'll just eat and go to bed. But Snow White and the animals clean up for them, which some people take issue with because it's the dwarves' cottage and they should be the ones cleaning it up. The thing is, Snow White is a courteous person. She could just barge in and throw her power around, making demands and forcing them to do whatever she wants. That's definitely something the evil queen would do. Instead, she wants to earn her room and board, saying she'll clean up for them and hopefully they'll let her stay because of it.
I know. We'll clean the house and surprise them. Then maybe they'll let me stay.
Honestly, I'm not sure why people say Snow White doesn't have a personality. She's sassy, has a sense of humor, and takes charge, in an actually productive way, not in an authoritarian way. Snow White makes dinner for everyone, but she does force them to wash up before they eat, insisting they won't eat otherwise. While she believes she has to earn her room and board, she's still going to make them take better care of themselves, something I'm sure they'll do going forward. But she's also not going to just let them take advantage of her hospitality, and she shows leadership skills by taking charge. Overall, Snow White's a pretty well-rounded character, but she gets written off because it became popular to do so. Snow White isn't the only character that gets a lot of criticism from this film, though. The prince does too, and Rachel and Gal had some pretty choice words for him in their interviews.
I mean, you know, the original cartoon came out in 1937, and very evidently so. There's a big focus on her love story with a guy who literally stalks her.
Yeah.
Weird.
Super weird.
So we didn't do that this time.
But again, they're hardly the first people to accuse him of these things. I do think the prince suffered a lot from having most of his scenes cut, but I still think what we do get with him is more deep and nuanced than people give it credit for. First of all, it is implied in the movie that they've already known each other, even though it's not outright stated, and this is backed up by the fact that there are deleted scenes where the prince and Snow White are shown as children together. However, when Snow White's dad died, the evil queen isolated her, adding to the abuse she suffered, since isolation is a common form of abuse, and her only form of companionship were the animals that were around. I think it would have been interesting if the remake had expanded on these concepts from the original, but that remains to be seen. But still, the few short scenes we did get with them were still impactful, and in my opinion, a lot less problematic than people claim they were. They have their meet cute when he hears her singing, but she becomes startled and embarrassed because she's wearing rags. But he's able to make her comfortable enough to where the two of them share an indirect kiss. It's honestly pretty cute, except the evil queen is watching everything and she's furious. Frankly, I'm surprised she didn't stick the guards on him. His next major scene comes at the end, with the famous True Love's kiss scene. People argue that this is assault because she didn't consent to it, since she's unconscious. But I argue that's a bad faith reading of the scene. After she went missing, he went looking for her, and when he finally finds her, he thinks that she's dead, so he mourns her. The kiss itself clearly isn't a passionate one. There's no lust or even romance behind it. It's just a kiss goodbye, and he quickly moves on to grieving her. He was unaware that this is how the curse is broken. He was just mourning the loss of his loved one. But we do get that happy fairy tale ending, where the two of them are finally reunited and go off to live happily ever after. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs has persisted as a classic for over 80 years, and for good reason. In many ways, it set the standard for Disney, and it's ultimately what put them on the map. Its storytelling, animation, and music are all beautifully done, and honestly, I'd argue its characterization is pretty solid. The Evil Queen is such a nondescript moniker, but pretty much everyone associates it with the Queen from Snow White, because she's such an imposing and memorable presence. And while it would have been good to get that extended content with the Prince and Snow White, I still think they were able to do a lot with what they could do. Snow White has a lot of strength in her. Her will, perseverance, and bravery says a lot. And I find it disappointing that people tend to view strength in a pretty limited sense, specifically physical strength. And don't get me wrong, physical strength is great. I mean, who doesn't love a warrior princess? But there are a lot of ways to be strong. including strength of character, and dismissing her so flippantly is pretty unfair. I just wish Disney would be more appreciative and respectful of their own legacy. I mean, the entire reason the company even exists is because of that legacy, and it's one that's a lot stronger than Disney likes to make it out to be. Who knows, maybe the backlash they received will help them recontextualize their history. Snow White and Disney as a whole means a lot to a lot of people, but I guess time will tell. It'd definitely be interesting to see how things progress going forward, but that's my thoughts. What do you guys think? What do you think of the original Snow White? Let me know in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching everyone, I really appreciate it. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to our members: Tyrant Carnivore, Shiny Orc Boy, Depth Charge Media, Samaru163, Gabby Hime, Verdant Range, JVR, Equestron, Norman Sweet Cream, Way Beyond Coincidence, Hunter Rose, 80s Nostalgia Guy, Felix Bam, Lucas Geist, J Draws, Meowsers, Sky, Philip, Isaac Martinez, Garcia XV Legend, Tobias Weller, Bandito Bane, Mac B909, Dakari the Professor, Todd McCaffrey, Omni Fair, General Bolivar, Cavalcoj, Strider Exile, Phil C, Killer Bomb, Slawa Saporiguez, Entwined Boot 301, Griffin of Might, Frankie Camarillo, Datadyne Executive, Crimson Phantom, and Jin the Goblin. Thank you for the support. And if you want to become a member, you can hit the join button next to the subscribe button. We also have Buy Me Coffee if you want to support us that way. And if you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And that part's free. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.